So I'd like to invite Professor Chibli Malat and our next panelist, distinguished group of panelists, to take the podium. Again, just to remind everyone, each panelist will talk for about 10 minutes. Professor Malat will then pose some questions to the panelists. We'll then open it up for a Q&A. And again, just to remind everyone, the proceedings are recorded, both audio and video. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Blum. Well, Dean Minow yesterday said how on the 12th of September 2011, we were all intuitively apprehensive of what would happen. We knew something had changed fundamentally in our lives, but we didn't quite know what changed and what would that change constitute in terms of our lives. Other than the more restricted aspects of travel, I'm not sure that 10 years later we are far more advanced in knowing exactly what happened to us in the wake of 9/11. And so this panel, I think, is very much in the heart of our continuous investigation and understanding of the world as it has changed. And I must say that I'm so delighted to moderate this panel because three of the panelists are very good friends with whom I've worked in various instances, even as a practitioner, but also that I've had the pleasure of reading over the years. And the fourth one has just turned into a very good friend. So you can see that the atmospherics of this panel are very much informed by our closeness. That doesn't mean that this is not going to be a very sharp debate. And I would like to turn the floor immediately to our wonderful speakers. You will find their biographies. It will take the whole day to go through each one. But I just wanted to point out three elements as I've been thinking about the session this morning and the topics of Muslims and the West. Three topics that seem to be dominant, certainly at the juncture of the discourse between daily politics and the scholarship that we carry out in the field of Islamic and Middle Eastern law. One topic is the continuous question about the nature of what happened on 9/11 from the perspective of international law and from the perspectives of various countries that have apprehended it. I've been defending constantly the categorization of what happened in 9/11 as a crime against humanity, as opposed to the dominant category that it is attached with in law as an act of terrorism. Maybe this has no importance and things would have developed in the same way. I'm not so sure, but it's a debate that has carried on, that I carry on continuously to date with my students and with my colleagues, whether the judicial process possible under international criminal law when the case of 9/11 is properly put in one category does not have immense consequences in terms of the logic of what happened afterwards. The other dimension that I think has become rather important and increasingly dominant, and I was just speaking with Mr. and Mrs. Hauser about this, it's this apprehension of Islamic law in a way which today is portraying it amongst circles that have some importance and influence in the United States as the new enemy. And openly so as an enemy that is of the stature of what the Soviet Union represented in its heyday. So I think this is a debate that is going to remain with us. We don't have immediate answers. We know that it goes profoundly. A number of constitutions in states in the United States have changed the language of the Constitution in order to ban Islamic law and or international law. So it's a debate that is going to be quite important, I think, for our lives in the decade to come. And finally, there is this happy novelty, but also a fraught novelty, which is the so-called Arab Spring. I prefer to call it the Middle East Revolution, not to exclude Israel, not to exclude Iran, but also because I think it is a Middle East revolution, and the Middle East nonviolent revolution at that. This is a phenomenon, of course, which has occupied our thinking for the past year and is likely to occupy it in the coming decade. So with these 3 pointers, I leave it to our wonderful panelists to choose what they would like to talk about, and perhaps Tamara would start.
Well, Shibli, thank you so much, and I want to thank Gabby and Ben, and most of all, thank the Harvard Law School students who did so much work putting this conference together. It's a great opportunity to be here and engage with a wonderful group of colleagues, and I expect that our discussion today will be intellectually enriching for me as much as for you, if not more. So I'm going to talk about a small subset of the broader topic that is the umbrella for this panel, U.S. relations with Muslim communities around the world, because I only work on the Middle East. But as Shibli said, the events in the Middle East over the last 8 months, 9 months have created a very dramatic and in many ways unprecedented environment for us to reflect on this broader topic. And so let me just touch on a few points. Fundamentally, although I understand that there's a lot of uncertainty and anxiety associated with events in the region, we see what's taking place in the Middle East today as a time of tremendous promise. There's an incredible opportunity here, of course, for people in the region, but also for the United States and more broadly for the international community and for those who care about security and stability in the region. And I think that there are 3 key reasons why that's the way I look at it, and that's the way we're approaching it in the State Department that I want to walk through with you. The first is very simple, and it was a subject of great discussion in yesterday's panel as well, which is the relationship between democracy and security, especially when it comes to violent extremism. When democracy and democratic freedoms are valued, we gain in security. Democracies generally increase the space for peaceful dissent. They give people more of a stake in their governance and in their public institutions. And as a result, democracy generally greatly weakens the appeal of those who call for violence. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that democracies never produce terrorism or never play host to terrorism, and we certainly have evidence of that within our own society as well. But democracy is a very important means for helping a society remain resilient in the face of those social phenomena, less vulnerable to terrorism and its impact, and more particularly, I think, less vulnerable in terms of the broader social and political impact. A second reason why I look at these developments in the region as fundamentally hopeful is because of the way they came about. And Shibli referred to this, particularly in Egypt and Tunisia, the nonviolent, non-ideological, impressively disciplined and determined nature of these mass movements. These protesters put forward perhaps the most powerful repudiation that one could imagine to the extremist narrative put forward by al-Qaeda and other terrorists in the region and across the globe, who, for their part, are preaching violence, preaching confrontation as the only mechanism to achieve dignity, to achieve change. And I think what Egyptians and Tunisians showed the region and the world is the power of peaceful popular protest to achieve dignity and to achieve change. So that they were able to bring more profound and meaningful change to Egypt in 10 days than Ayman al-Zawahiri was able to do in 10 years. That is an incredible phenomenon. Gallup has been doing a lot of polling in Egypt since the revolution, and one of the most striking findings of that polling is that Egyptians reject violence against civilians, whether by government or non-government actors, at a higher rate than anywhere else Gallup polls in the world. It's 85 or 90% across the polls that they've been doing this year. So that's just one manifestation, I think, of the impact of these events in the region. I think there's a third and kind of deeper reason to think about the events of the Arab awakening as promising and hopeful for the region and for the United States in the region and for stability and security. It takes a little bit longer to explain, so bear with me. But fundamentally, the dramatic events that we've witnessed this year were driven by some very deep underlying trends in the region, trends that have been building in many ways for a decade or more. And because of these longer-term trends, the status quo, the political status quo within these countries was not stable, had not been stable, and it was, in fact, increasingly brittle and unsustainable. So that old Middle East of a year ago, or of 10 years ago, is gone, and it's gone forever. From this point on, if there is going to be lasting stability in the Middle East, it will be built on a foundation of a renewed social contract between government and citizens that will rely on a set of really profound political and economic reforms. Those deep underlying trends are demographic, they're economic, they're related to the youth bulge in the region, the combination of that with endemic corruption and sort of long-standing structural economic problems that did not allow either for sufficient growth to accommodate that younger generation or for adequate distribution of growth so that income inequality was growing across the region, even in wealthier states. And those two trends, the demographic and the economic, combined with the rise of new media tools, I think really helped contribute to what we saw. And I think that the power of the media is worth settling on just for a moment, because we talk a lot about Twitter and Facebook and the impact that they had on these protests, but I think we have to kind of go a layer below that to examine it. Twitter and Facebook were important, but I think we're also talking about older new media, things like satellite television, like Al Jazeera, and just the fundamental increase in the access to information for citizens in the region and for the rest of us about what was going on in the region. So that if you are a young, unemployed man in Egypt, it doesn't just mean that you don't have a job. It means you can't move out of your parents' house. You can't get married. You can't start a family of your own. Your entire life is on hold. And you see that the opportunities around you are made available based on who you know, not on what you know or what you can do. And then you have the ability to compare your life and the gap between your aspirations and your opportunities to the lives of people in countries that you think of as your peers, Indonesia or India or Brazil. And you see much more dynamism there than you have at home. And then, of course, once events began to take place, these people had the ability to convey to the outside world quickly what was taking place within their own societies. So that in Syria, where international journalists have been banned for months, we still have daily evidence of the brutality of the Syrian regime against peaceful protesters. So the media, I think, has had a very profound impact, but it's certainly not all about Facebook. But coming back to the broader point, these trends have been building for a long time in the region, and they've been having an impact on the stability of politics in the region for a long time. And what's crystal clear today is that for people across the region, whether the underlying problems are primarily economic or social or political, they've made clear that they see political change, they see democracy as the way to resolve those other issues. And therefore, the path to lasting stability in the region is only going to come through change that responds to those aspirations. Now, as I said at the outset, there is a lot of anxiety in this moment. The path to democracy is rocky. We've seen in many other regions of the world how uncertain, how fraught a path that can be. But I think from our perspective, we see an incredible strategic opportunity here, not only with respect to combating the ideology put forward by violent extremists, but also because we believe a Middle East that's characterized by more transparent, accountable, responsive government will be more stable, will better reflect the interests of citizens in peace, in dignity, in opportunity, and that will provide not only more opportunity for us to partner with those societies, but a more stable and reliable foundation on which we can build that strategic partnership. We can have a strategic partnership with countries in the region that's rooted in mutual interests, people to people, as well as government to government, and that's rooted in broader consensus. And that, I think, is a very powerful possibility and one that we're seeking to exploit. There are a lot of ways that we can do that, but I think that we have to recognize in all of our efforts that what's happening in the Middle East today is fundamentally not about us. It's driven by the people in the region. It's driven by their priorities and their agenda, and what we can do is seek to shape it in ways that promote the positive vision that the young people of the region themselves have put forward for their own future. So we can talk about tools, we can talk about implications, but why don't I stop there? Thanks, Shibli.
Thank you, Doctor. This is a wonderful start. I would like to suggest and take advantage, if Professor Bloom allows me, that since the speaker has been so attentive to time, that what we do is to take 5 minutes of questions and comments for each speaker, and then at the end we can combine them. So let me start, Tamara, with the first question. Talking about nonviolence, the news today, and it's a news that has been coming from Syria, is that because of the frustration in the inability of the revolution to reach its goal, which is regime change in Syria, people in Syria are increasingly thinking that, one, we need foreign intervention. It's called foreign intervention neutrally, but in fact one is talking about a Libya-style type of right to protect military support for Hama and other places like this. And they're talking about abandoning that sacred attachment to nonviolence that we've seen in Syria and for which we are so awed over the past 6 months. So the question today is, in this vision, what can be done, do you think, in Syria to keep the nonviolence on a winning cause, and to respond inevitably also to the nature of any foreign intervention that you're considering?
Well, first let me say I think it's important to think about intervention not in a dichotomous manner. And I think that the United States and others in the international community have been very engaged in responding to the situation in Syria and in trying to shape an environment in which the Syrian government and the Syrian leadership make a different set of choices, stop the violence, allow Syrian citizens to express themselves peacefully, and allow a process of democratic transition to begin. That's clearly what Syrian citizens want. That, you know, our engagement has been at the level of diplomacy. It's been at the level of action at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva. It's been at the level of sanctions against individuals and organizations that are implicated in abuses of civilians. And that's, you know, an escalating level of pressure that's been a combined effort of a lot of countries around the world who are deeply concerned by this violence. And I understand what you're saying about the potential for the situation in Syria to shift in a negative direction. But I think the fundamental reality that we have to focus on is the fact that this potential for instability, for continued or regional instability, the potential for negative violent outgrowths beyond the violence inflicted by the Syrian state is itself because of the behavior and choices of the Syrian government. They're the ones who are generating this threat for the region. and they are the ones who have the power to ameliorate it. And so what we're very focused on is taking steps that can sharpen for them the choices and alter their behavior.
But let me see if our panelists would first be interested in raising a point or a discussion with Tamara. Please.
Tamara, I want to ask you a little bit about Egypt. In the last couple of weeks, it seems that the more thuggish elements in the Egyptian populace have taken the stage, the so-called ultras, who are basically rampant soccer fans who were incensed by confrontation with the police and then took that out on the Israeli embassy. If that's the future of Egypt, then aren't we reenacting what the poet Yeats predicted when he said that the best lack all conviction while the worst are full of passionate intensity?
Well, you know, I think in any society there's the potential for, and certainly in any democratic transition, there's the potential for that kind of manifestation. But in any open society, there's the potential for, you know, national pride to veer into jingoism or xenophobia. There's the potential for political freedom to be abused by those who are trying to make political hay out of other issues, or engage in hate speech or incite people to violence. And that potential exists in any democratic society. I think all of us struggle, you know, and each society finds its own answers in how to protect against those vulnerabilities and how as a society, not only through law, but in our political culture and in our social practice to defend ourselves against those vulnerabilities. But to say that because those things manifest, therefore the whole path is wrong, I think is too swift a conclusion.
But here the consequence could be a wider war in the Middle East, so aren't the stakes even higher?
I think what we've seen in the wake of last week's incident is very strong expressions, public expressions of commitment, both by the Israeli government and the Egyptian government, to the peace treaty between them. And I think it's also quite clear that the priority of the Egyptian people is not a war in the Middle East. The priority of the Egyptian people is an elected government that's responsive to their interests domestically and to their needs. And so I fully expect that as that democratic process takes hold, those interests will manifest.
Thank you. Let's go on now, Dr. Mir Ahmadi.
Thank you. I also want to thank all the wonderful people that were responsible for putting on this conference and allowing me to participate. I have had the distinct honor of presenting in front of British royalty and American presidents, but as a lawyer, nothing makes me as proud as being at Harvard Law School. So thank you for that privilege. So I think in order to accurately assess the post-9/11 world and a direction the U.S. government takes with Muslim communities, we need to take a step back and look at another watershed moment in history, 1979. Although there were many changes across the Muslim world brewing at that time, including the revolution in Iran, it's the conflict in Afghanistan that provided the radical Islamists the critical opening they needed to spread their ideologies and their agenda. As we all know, a U.S.-led alliance supplied a steady stream of militants to fight in Afghanistan. Their institutions, as a consequence, became well endowed and enabled them to rapidly open training camps throughout the world. After the war ended, these warriors looked for new battlegrounds in Bosnia, Somalia, Chechnya, Pakistan, and Yemen. These militant movements have influenced numerous political groups, both with violent and professed nonviolent platforms, including the Jamaat Islamiyah of Egypt, the Jamaat Islamiyah of Pakistan, and the Tablighi Jama'ah, who has professed missionary objectives, but whose promulgated belief system has led many of their followers to future on into terrorist groups. So if we fast forward 30 years to places like the southern Punjab in Pakistan, you will find these well-established institutions created by the former Mujahideen of Afghanistan launching multi-pronged attacks against mainstream Muslim networks, cultural landmarks, and the political establishment. In 2010 alone, about 20 shrines were attacked, and in numerous cases, bodies of revered saints and religious figures were disinterred and publicly desecrated. These Islamists are not only violent, but they have also popularized drastic concepts such as takfirism, which is the practice of declaring anyone who does not conform to their belief system as an unbeliever and subject to death in Islamic law. In Somalia, al-Shabaab has killed hundreds of religious scholars, academics, and politicians who had historically promoted religious freedom, pluralism, and social harmony. Despite the fact that the Islamist narrow belief systems has engendered an ethos of intolerance and anti-Americanism, many of them have historically enjoyed technical assistance and training from U.S.-funded democracy programs. For example, our Word research team in Pakistan recently learned that it is the Islamist and Deobandi madrasas in Pakistan's tribal frontier that are the dominant educational institutions to receive peace and conflict resolution training. Similarly, the Islamist Party of the Jamaat Islamiyah receives good governance and democracy training from a range of Western institutions like IRI and NDI, whereas faith-based political parties established by mainstream Muslims are sidelined. A large part of why the U.S. invests in these groups is because the Islamists have been building their institutional capacity since 1979 and have a very sophisticated international presence. They continue to enjoy a largesse of foreign financing, and they have created modern institutions, flashy websites in English, and developed mature PR skills. As one of the US-funded NGOs in Pakistan explained, we reach out to these Islamist madrasas because they're easier to access than other faith-based institutions. In comparison, the moderate majority is disorganized, fragmented, and underfunded. One community activist put it best when he lamented that they are 30 years behind the game. As a result, the average Muslim lacks the tools to effectively compete and cannot provide viable alternatives for their constituents. The socio-political dynamics in other at-risk countries are strikingly similar and require common elements of success. They need partnerships with the West to empower the authentic cultural and religious networks that up until now have been ignored as part of the solution. In a worst-case scenario, if we fail to act now effectively, these mainstream networks will likely turn to arming themselves as they have already done in Somalia and previously did in Chechnya. It is important to know that although global Islamist movements often tout Western democratic values in public, within their constituents they continue to promote the us versus them mentality, which effectively prohibits the US investment in them having any substantial long-term impact. In our research with Muslim communities around the world, moderate Muslims are increasingly fearful of the deconstruction of their social norms caused by the extremists who impose rigid religious laws, who subjugate their women, and eliminate all semblance of personal freedom. If there is one lesson to be learned from history, we should choose our partners wisely. In a sense, 9/11 should have been a wake-up call to forge partnerships with authentic thought leaders and activists who uphold universal values of humanity. And I don't mean that the US diplomacy to engage in Islamic groups like the Muslim Brotherhood should stop. It means that there should be a difference between engaging and empowering. Such a shift in policy will take patience and perseverance on both sides. Throughout the world, Muslims who espouse shared universal values, such as the right to religious freedom, advocating nonviolence and conflict resolution, and respect for the government's rule of law and its ability to provide social justice, are countering radicalism in many ways. They publish books, write pamphlets and websites denouncing terrorism in an authentic religious paradigm that is palatable to at-risk youth and mainstream Muslims. They challenge the belief structure of the violent extremists who tell the young people that the only way to achieve resolution of their grievances is to engage in militant jihad. Their counter-narrative not only rejects violence, but it emphasizes compassion for humanity, community service, and social cohesion, values which are cherished by any society. As part of the government's international agenda to counter violent extremism, part of the initiative needs to go beyond disengaging people from violence and instead fostering a pluralistic, socially responsible Muslim identity. It should include publications and resources for the mothers, the fathers, and the friends of the at-risk population, and to rapidly identify when someone in their community displays disturbing behavior and where they can go for help. Despite the immense potential of the mainstream Muslim networks to lead CVE efforts, these groups have been largely underutilized. The future of U.S. diplomacy with Muslim-majority countries should be focused on tailoring our foreign assistance to the right groups. The U.S. can also facilitate the preservation and restoration of socio-cultural practices that build community resilience against radicalization. In the UK and Singapore and Pakistan and elsewhere, I have found that this approach successfully creates the alternative urban social movement necessary for at-risk youth. Extremists know that these practices produce social harmony and often try every intimidation tactic to ban these practices. So the question on everyone's mind today is, how will U.S. foreign policy change in response to the new Middle East? But I wish we would have asked ourselves what we could have done to better prepare these societies for the change. Our failure to direct foreign aid and diplomacy towards the values and norms that we cherish has resulted in immature and, in most places, non-existent civil society infrastructure for the mainstream Muslim communities. If we carefully invest in their social sector, these communities will develop their own genuine democratic culture of freedom and liberty. Thank you.
Thank you for a wonderfully short and precise talk.
I saw the 3-minute note and I just started hurrying.
It's just wonderful because I think that you're eliciting so many questions that to allow us. Well, let me start with one, if I may. The elephant in the what I call Sunni international room.
Did you say Sunni international?
Yeah,
room?
Sunni international as opposed to Shia international,
right.
where the elephant is evident, is Saudi Arabia.
Right.
And so I hear you, and I think that from looking not so much as an expert, but as an interested observer, that there is a very genuine work that has developed in Pakistan and in Southeast Asia, of which we see fruit. There is still this elephant called Saudi Arabia, which historically has been the main provider of the funds and the ideology that is an ideology of hatred.
Absolutely.
So my question is,
what do we do about it?
What are we doing about Saudi Arabia?
I think in a track one diplomacy between the United States and Saudi Arabia, there has been an effort for U.S. government officials, maybe Tamara can speak about this more, about trying to, and Juan maybe too, to talk about moving them towards controlling this kind of exportation of extremism and hatred. But I think what a lot of the Saudi officials will tell you is that it's a Frankenstein that's out of their control. It's already been established for 30 years. These schools already have the textbooks. It requires a massive reinvention of these programs in order to stop its effect. So it requires not only a change in how they direct the funds, but basically removing that old literature, replacing it with new literature, retraining imams. I don't know if you're familiar with the imam training program that the Wahhabis offered for decades. Was, they went to Saudi Arabia, they were trained, they studied, they went back, they started new communities. They would recruit five more imams, went over, studied, trained, come back, open new mosques. So, I mean, this network is just massive. So it's not simply a diplomatic problem. I mean, it's a large scale. I mean, it's the world's problem. So I don't think there's an easy solution.
I don't know if Tamara or Intisar would like to weigh in on this. Well, Tamara, I don't want to embarrass you, Saudi Arabia, but
I think your comments raise a really interesting question, because you expressed a desire that the goal of U.S. government engagement in this sphere should be fostering a pluralistic Muslim identity. And that was a really interesting way of framing the issue, because I would say that over the last 10 years, the U.S. government has sought, and I think in the last 2 years, sought in a very concerted and directed way to broaden our engagement with civil society, certainly in the Middle East. Certainly using tools like the program that I supervise, the Middle East Partnership Initiative, to reach out to civil society across the region, precisely to support those who are engaged in activities that advance pluralism. But advancing pluralism within society, within political culture, advancing a democratic process is not the same thing as advancing a certain vision for the Muslim community or for Muslim identity, which seems to me, in a sense, to veer over into picking winners. And I wonder whether there ought to be, or how you think about the issue of the relevant distinction between government efforts and non-government efforts with respect to that issue of picking winners.
I think this often comes up, and it comes up, and it's interesting that it comes up always in U.S. diplomatic circles, that we cannot pick the right Islam. We cannot pick winners, and I'm not talking about picking winners as if they're horses in a horse race. I'm talking about partnering with people that share our values. And so, as David Cameron very notably said now in the new Prevent strategy, that we want to empower groups that share our vision for the future. And so I think that means that it's accepting and believing that there are Muslims, and a majority of Muslims, who do believe in the same intrinsic human values that we do, and saying, you know what, I like your vision, and we want to help you develop that vision. Very distinct from engaging other groups that don't share our vision and having to have a diplomatic relationship with those people. But I'm talking about our technical assistance, our foreign assistance programming should reflect the people that we are as a society.
Well,
yeah, I just wanted sharing our values. You know, arguably the Shiites in Bahrain and the doctors share our values. The Palestinians who believed in divestment, nonviolent divestment, share our values. And the Syrians who are being shot right now share our values. Are these the people you want to help?
Well, I mean, I think the Shias of Bahrain is a very broad group. So it depends. I'm talking about very tailored foreign assistance programs and what they claim to be the vision that they are espousing for those programs. So I'm not talking about all of government and what it's going to do in terms of deciding whether a country is going to be liberated or sit under its current authority. I'm talking about technical foreign assistance programs that develop the civil society infrastructure of a country.
I think we've heard you. I think there's a shared dimension here, at least between you and our questioner, that yes, we should pick winners. So, whereas Tamara has some doubts about this.
Well, no, I guess what I'm saying is that, at least in the region where I spend my time, number one, I think we're doing what you'd like us to be doing. Our foreign assistance doesn't go to the Muslim Brotherhood. Our foreign assistance goes to party-building programs that work with a wide variety of groups that are committed to democratic rules of the game, that are committed to minority protections, that are committed to preserving and promoting a democratic process. And to be quite honest, the issues with engagement with the Brotherhood in Egypt have more to do with their reluctance to engage with the United States. So, you know, at least in my region, I see us doing what you would advocate. But it seems to me that our role here is to support a pluralistic, a diverse political marketplace. Because to the extent that you have a quality public discourse, then you're going to see political groups emerge with broader support that are supporting the interests of the population, that represent the interests of the population. And as you say, and as I think we have abundant public opinion surveys and other evidence, the majority of the population in this region is moderate, is looking for
same things out of life that we do.
The same things out of life that we are. And so, you know, we support that process. We support the development of that process. The outcome of that process is not for us to determine. And I think actually what's so powerful about this moment, again, in the Middle East, because that's what I know, is that, you know, it's in many ways a mark of how resilient Arab societies are, that despite having been victimized themselves by terrorism over many years, and despite having been subjected to these violent ideologies over a long period of time, it's the people of the region who have now put forward this positive agenda for themselves. So it seems to me much more powerful for us to recognize that, embrace that, support the process that they are generating out of that, than to say, okay, you've got the right idea for the process, and you don't.
Intisar?
And I'd like to just interject here a comment on the importance that I see of educational institutions or educational and other civil society institutions, to circle back to the question of Saudi Arabia being the elephant in the room that maybe now has been exposed, now that Shibli has exposed it. And so really, I think their greatest draw was in the religious and educational spheres rather than the political spheres. This is where they gain sort of the traction that they do when it comes to defining what Islam is and what it is not. And in promoting pluralism and picking winners or even avoiding picking winners, I think it's important to focus on the spheres where the pluralism can appear, particularly when it relates to what Islamic law in particular are, and the diversity that was always present but that sort of gets collapsed in the modern day. And my optimism perhaps tells me that even looking at the elephant in the room, even if it remains an elephant, I see more internal diversity in even Saudi Salafi ideology as it spreads forth and as technologies change the way the Saudis are able to control and spread the message in these religious and educational spheres.
Great. Well, we'll certainly go back to all of this and anticipate a lot what you have to say, Intisar. But let's move on with Professor Raskoff. Your 10 minutes are starting now.
Thank you, Shibli. Thank you very much. Thank you once again to Gabi and to Ben for putting together this spectacular seminar and also for kind of launching this fascinating project that they've done. There are not two more interesting, dynamic, personable experts in this area than those two, and I think anyone who knows them understands what I mean by that. Shibli, I'd like to begin by saying that the elephant in the room is certainly not Tehran, at least not for my purposes. It's not even Riyadh. It's actually Columbus, Ohio. Because Columbus, Ohio is where a lot of some of the most problematic features of America's domestic counter-radicalization is going on right now. Specifically, the Ohio Department of Homeland Security in the last couple of years has convened an imam council, speak about picking winners, and has distributed literature that, among other things, includes the observation that jihad does not mean holy war, as many people are led to believe, but rather a struggle to achieve excellence. The term holy war is a European concept that began with the Crusades and was extended to Islam by the West. Now, let me just say right away, in case you're holding your breath, I'm not here to tell you that jihad means the opposite of what officials in the state of Ohio put into this brochure. What I am here to tell you is that these kinds of movements on the part of state officials in Ohio, the tendency to want to convene imam councils, the tendency to want to distribute official literature opining about the meaning of highly contested concepts within Islam, is emblematic of a larger trend on the part of American officials, if anything, a trend that's gained momentum over the last 2 years. And that's a trend to intervene actively into Islam and into the belief system of Muslims inside the United States. And I guess I would associate myself with the anti-winner picking kind of component of this panel and say at the outset that I'm deeply skeptical about this enterprise of counter-radicalization insofar as it implicates what I call an establishment of official Islam. And by official Islam, I mean a concept of Islam or concepts of Islam that are viewed by national security professionals within governments at the federal and the local level as being roughly kind of supportive of the national security objectives of the state. I'm skeptical more or less on two bases. I'm skeptical as a question or from the perspective of law. I'm skeptical that these kinds of projects conform to the expectations of the First Amendment's religion clauses, whether as a matter of doctrine or more as a question of values. I'm also skeptical about their strategic wisdom and their efficacy. And I think the question about strategy and the question about law more or less coalesce into a kind of a common argument that these kinds of activities are the sorts of activities that government officials on the whole should shy away from. So what I'd like to do very, very briefly is as follows. I'd like to give you a little bit more of a flavor of what's actually going on under the banner of domestic counter-radicalization. I'd like to develop, once again, in summary fashion, some of these skeptical kind of views, the legal and the strategic, and then tell you a little bit about how I think we ought to be going forward in this area, if in fact we're not going to be totally kind of abdicating any official role in the context of shaping Islam up to and including in the domestic context. We should at least kind of be doing so in a way that's calculated to be most effective and most workable under our legal norms. Okay, so very briefly, what are we doing under the banner of counter-radicalization? I would say what we're doing is three things. We're engaging with specific elements within Muslim community or Muslim communities inside the United States. That's to say that officials are doing things of the sort that I kind of described in Ohio. It's not just local government that's doing it. The U.S. Attorney in Portland, Oregon created a network, that's his term, of Muslim community leaders motivated by the desire, quote, to educate Muslim partners and give them resources and support their counter-radicalization. The Department of Homeland Security has been very actively involved in this business. The Department of Justice has, through its U.S. attorneys. The National Counterterrorism Center convened a conference in Hartford, Connecticut, where one of the panels was devoted to, quote, understanding radicalization to seeking a counter-reformation in Islam. That was one of the panel discussions at an NCTC conference. So I'm not here to tell you that the State Department has been dispatching American imams overseas, including Khalid Latif, who's the chaplain of the NYPD and also the chaplain of New York University, the Islamic chaplain, on overseas trips to represent American Islam to the world. Any one of these activities taken unto itself is kind of fairly benign. I'm not kind of imputing bad motivation, the opposite actually, to these sorts of activities. But I think cumulatively they speak to an emerging appetite on the part of officials to engage in these sorts of kind of shaping of ideology, precisely because shaping of ideology presents itself as a more attractive and kind of low-key and obviously kind of less kinetic way of getting at the problem of terrorism. So that's kind of a sense of what's going on at the level of engagement. There's not just engagement, there's what I call bureaucratic entrenchment. That is to say that the government itself is shaping the way it's organized to do business in counter-radicalization. The point I'd like to kind of emphasize is that a lot of what goes on under the banner of domestic intelligence inevitably implies government decision-making that has to mark the boundary between radical Islam or potentially radical Islam on the one hand and more mainstream Islam on the other. So these are the sorts of decisions that are implicit in the enterprise of national security counterterrorism going on within the United States and specifically within the business of domestic intelligence. And there's also an expressive dimension to this. It's not just brochures that are being distributed by Ohio officials. It's also senior administration officials who are staking a claim to the meaning of contested concepts within Islam. Jihad, for obvious reasons, becomes the subject of a lot of official commentary and kind of purported kind of illumination on the part of American national security officials. But this is so almost banal at this point that we hardly pay attention to the fact that what's being discussed and commented upon is a concept that has a deep kind of legal conceptual pedigree within the tradition of Islamic law. So that's kind of roughly what's going on. Roughly, why am I skeptical? Well, I'll put a kind of name on my skepticism in connection with the law, and that is, pardon the kind of the jargon here, anti-Erastianism. Because it turns out that one of the key drivers of the First Amendment's Establishment Clause was precisely that the founders of this republic were concerned about the manner in which European governments, quintessentially the British government, had manipulated religion to achieve secular effects. In other words, it was an aggrandizement on the part of the state whereby the state would essentially redirect the energies of certain religions or religious communities in order to achieve some kind of secular goal. I think of counter-radicalization as being in some ways totally emblematic of that phenomenon. In some ways, therefore, counter-radicalization strikes me as being a much more fundamental violation or let me rephrase that, in being much more fundamental tension with core Establishment Clause values than many of the other issues that surface in American constitutional law surrounding the Establishment Clause. This creche, that display of 10 Commandments, and so on and so forth. I think we're actually talking about the kind of for real Establishment Clause when we talk about counter-radicalization. When it comes to strategy, and again, I kind of link strategy with law in my analysis. When it comes to strategy, I mean, I don't think it's an accident, Hedya, that 30 years ago, the United States proved ineffective or lousy at picking winners. I don't think it's an accident that in the last decade, we've messed up again. I think it speaks to a fundamental lack of capacity on the part of American officials, or any Western officials perhaps, to understand the issues and then to deliver and to execute on their understanding. So I think it's actually something that's endemic. I think it's almost built in to the decision-making process on the part of American officials. It's no coincidence that we keep screwing this up, and I think it will be no coincidence when in 10 or 20 years from now we reflect upon counter-radicalization as being yet another manifestation of this kind of tendency to try, for good reasons and for wholesome reasons, but to try and ultimately to fail. I'd also like to associate myself with something that Shibli said earlier about legislation banning Sharia in places like Oklahoma, and to say that I think that's not unconnected to this tendency on the part of American officials to want to weigh in on the meaning of Islam. Ben Weisner from the ACLU looks at me skeptically, but here's my argument. But here's, curiously, good. Well, my answer to that is that I think for the government actively to get into the business of shaping the meaning of Islam and to kind of offer up these bromides as to kind of what Islamic concepts mean, in a sense invites a kind of a reaction. And it's not just a reaction from bigots within society, it's actually a reaction from within government. So we've seen reports of late that FBI officials and trainers have been busy trying to kind of train FBI analysts, and this goes on not just, unfortunately, not just in FBI, but across government, in the view that mainstream Islam doesn't exist, everything is violent, Islam itself is endemically violent, and so on and so forth. I think the government, in a sense, I'm not going to say it brings on this kind of activity, but it doesn't serve the larger objective of calling those sorts of presentations and that kind of bigotry for what it is by, in a sense, entering into a dialogue about the meaning of Islam. So where do we go from here? Very, very briefly, I think where we go from here is to organizations like yours. It's to civil society. It's to a standing down on the part of officialdom in this area. And if anything, if there's going to be any progress in the way of counter-radicalization at the level of shaping ideas and kind of intervening into a so-called war of ideas, I think it has to be accomplished by people who are empowered to speak within the various Islamic communities inside the United States and around the world. And I think any amount, or to the degree that there's government involvement in these activities, I think the legal and strategic questions will never go away.
Well, that was quite counterintuitive, and so I'm so impressed that I can't even ask a question. But so Hedya has a question.
I have a question. Sam, do you think do you think it's fair to say that the government can do CVE, can do countering violent extremism without addressing religious tenets? For example, I actually don't think the government of Ohio or the Department of Justice, which is publishing a book on Arabic terms that I personally edited, should be talking about what Islamic terms are. But can't they, as a White House brief came out with, say that we could partner with Muslim communities to help them accomplish these goals? So stay out of religion, but still look to empower and uplift the community that is trying to respond to the threat.
Well, I think that's an improvement over a kind of a more overt intervention, but I don't think it makes the problem go away. I think it's still there at the level of subtext. And let me just kind of develop an element that I think is kind of latent in your question, which is one of the strategies on the part of government in this area has been to say we're not actively talking about religion, we're talking about politics, and to the degree that we're talking about kind of radical Islam, it's the political component of radical Islam that we're motivated to want to kind of address here. So in a sense, this is a kind of a political issue. This is ideological, but in the sense of our politics against their politics. To be blunt, I don't buy that. Any more than I buy the capacity of government to say, with respect to a kind of Jewish community, well, Israel is politics and your religion is your religion, or to an evangelical community, your commitment to this or that issue in American politics, that's politics, but your faith is your faith. I mean, I think these distinctions are hard to draw at all, and they're impossible to draw on the part of officials with an axe to grind.
Then.
Sam, I wanted to, I'm completely fascinated by your presentation, but I want to push you a little bit on the sort of asymmetry between why law enforcement agencies and other agencies are, you know, getting involved in the way that Columbus is getting involved, and sort of stuff like what's going on in Oklahoma, which is frankly bigoted and not really worth our discussion much. But it seems to me that the instinct for, however ridiculous the presentation of it is, that the instinct about what's going on in Portland or what's going on in Columbus is a community relations instinct that has to do with, a concern that there are things that are going to happen in the community in which they are operating, i.e., I mean, certainly in Portland is a very acute example of that. Mm-hmm. If you do not establish a very significant relationship between law enforcement and the community in question. And while I'm totally persuaded by your skepticism of the modality of that interaction, it does leave the vacuum of, well, what should that interaction look like? Because one option for the Portland U.S. attorney, whom I actually had some interactions with about what he's trying to do, and is a very serious-minded guy, well, you do have to create the kind of relationship in which the community is going to engage with the Bureau, right? And that you're going to be able to do what you need to do in the context of a respectful relationship with the community. And I guess the question is, what does that interaction, like, I totally buy it does not look like what you read about Columbus, but what does it look like? And is there a way to have that conversation and have that sort of law enforcement community interaction that doesn't implicate the United States government in the definition of Islam?
I think the short answer to that, Ben, and thanks for the question, is yes. And I think it looks a lot like the term that you invoke, community affairs or community relations. I think that's historically how law enforcement communities have engaged with ethnic, religious communities, with immigrant populations across the board. And I think that's been going on forever. That should continue to go on. And I don't see why those sorts of interactions shouldn't become the forum for the government, the U.S. Attorney in Portland or whomever, conveying their concerns to the community and having a kind of open communication line there. What I think is different and characteristic about counter-radicalization is the sense that the government isn't just looking to have dialogue, that the government has what amounts to a strategic intervention in mind and is conceiving of that relationship as being one way of furthering a strategic goal that the government regards as being essential to its overall counterterrorism. But I do think that open lines of communication and community relations should continue to go on. I would note also, kind of from my personal experience, that FBI has occasionally, I think actually more than occasionally, tended to cause their community relations and their more security-minded work to converge. And I think that's been a problem for FBI. One of the things that the NYPD does, and I think it's been right in the way it's done it, is to keep very separate and distinct the community relations work that it does and the more security-minded work that it does. So I think community relations has to endure, I mean, and has to, if anything, become more prominent. But I think the blending of that, this gets to the point I was trying to make last night, or the question I was asking, the inflection of that kind of activity with national security, I think, is exactly what's concerning about this.
All right. Well, I don't know if we're reaching a point where we can divide the table between those who pick winners and those who don't pick winners. And whether the injection of the nuance of government getting involved in picking winners and not picking winners domestically and internationally is not an advance that we have reached in our discussion so far. But in either case, let's see how ultimately the table is going to weigh. And I can't think of a better person than Professor Intisar Rab.
Sure, let me go ahead and fall down on the side of not picking winners. I also want to start off thanking Gabby and Ben, as well as Shibli and all the organizers of this conference. I'm also counting on the time delay in Shibli reaching me with a stop talking sign should I need extra time. But no, I'll try and stay within the 10 minutes. I want to start by just drawing your attention to a lesson that was driven home when I was clerking on the Third Circuit, and that was with respect to issues of framing language in decisions that we were drafting. So I remember one of the judges on the Third Circuit pointing out, don't put in the opinion the person discharged a weapon in the direction of the decedent, but he shot a gun and killed the victim. Tell what happened rather than the story that the party that wants to win wants you to tell. And I think this is related in some ways to cases that I've seen involving Islamic law or Muslims in U.S. courts. So, for example, in a 2010 Minnesota case, I read something to the effect that the petitioner demanded halal food, permission to wear a kufi, and space for performing salat. And this may sound, very weird and nebulous, when they could have, in analyzing the case according to the neutral principles of law that the court has to analyze cases by, said in plain English terms, the petitioner requested that the prison make reasonable accommodations to allow for a religiously mandated diet, that he wear a skull cap when praying, and be allowed space to pray. Ultimately, in this case, the court determined that the religious claims were valid, but that the restrictions on those claims were also valid, in that a full accommodation would place a substantial burden on the safety and security of the prison. But reading that and reading cases that come out like that, I notice a difference in the way the court frames the issues, the Arabic terms that it uses, the foreign otherness that Islam and Islamic law tends to take on. And as concerned as I am always of issues of interpretation, these things sort of jump out at me. So I want to talk about framing and the significance of framing of some of these discussions post 9/11 in this area of domestic law and religious freedom. And sort of starting off with the framing of this panel, or the title of this panel, the U.S. Muslim relations. So I'll talk about that in a sec. And second, take a look at the courts, and to a lesser extent, the legislatures that have asked questions as they involve Muslims and Islamic law. And I don't really want to focus on the wave of anti-Sharia legislation because, as has been previously pointed out, I don't really think those are particularly interesting legal questions, but they're there nonetheless. And third, say a little bit about what all this says about the future, getting to the other part of the title, where are we heading, and where should we be heading? So the big point, and it's relevant to the title of this talk too, is U.S. Muslim relations. This suggests that the U.S. and Muslims are two separate entities that are on par with each other, and that it's worth examining the relationship between them. But we know that the U.S. is a nation. Muslims are a religious group spread across many nations, and the U.S. has many Muslims, and indeed has had many Muslims for years. And this is not a criticism of the organizers in framing or entitling the session, because indeed we are talking about Muslims domestically and Muslims abroad, but it is to point to a larger phenomenon that I see otherwise in the legal context that has to do with framing. So Muslims have been here for ages. They helped build the country from its inception through the civil rights movement. One example that points to the long-time Muslim presence actually stems from a 1991 discovery near Ground Zero of a burial ground for Muslims and other Africans from America's early period. They having been forcibly resettled in New York when it was still New Amsterdam. There are hundreds buried there, and the estimates are that 10% of all slaves brought over were Muslim. There was a big wave of conversion between the 1930s and 60s of the African American population, and also waves of migration from Muslim majority countries in the 1960s. So the estimates now are some 8 to 15 million, most of them having million Muslims in the United States, most having been born in America, and at least 25% as the single largest majority of plurality, African Americans. So is this just nitpicky? Why am I talking about this? Because the problem that the larger legal problem that I want to talk about depends on this framing of Muslims in America and issues of Islamic law as foreign, exotic, and something that needs to be dealt with as such. So there's a popular perception, and that's distinct from legal realities. And so let me talk about the two of those. In the popular perception, there's a growing momentum in the court of public opinion, if not in the courts proper, which I'll talk about in a minute, that Muslims and their beliefs and practices pose significant challenges to the American legal system, values, way of life, and in what ways. On the one hand, there is a physical threat to our society, goes the narrative, and so we see manifested in the war on terror either laws or encouragement to pass laws that regulate, control, and prosecute these Muslims in certain arenas. And second, the narrative goes that Muslims pose a threat to our values and our way of life. And so certain national stakeholders, along with state lawmakers, they've added this threat of an impending takeover of Muslims and Islamic law in the U.S. As Shibli started out with, this seems to be the new threat to American national security, but also values, on par with the communist threat, now that that's dissipated. So what I want to do is interrogate this second claim about values and assess whether and how this is in fact a problem for the future. And hopefully I'll come down in a way that's also counterintuitive enough to silence even Shibli from asking questions. So a view of the courts historically and then what's happening now is that historically, and this is from a recent survey of court cases from 1800 to 1960 involving claims of Islamic law or of Muslims, recently written by Marie Falinger, who found that on the one hand, American judges as a group portrayed an ambivalent attitude toward Muslims, some treating Islam disparagingly or as an exotic and fanciful religion. And on the other hand, judges often emphasized the religious equality that Muslims deserved, but they often did so in the context of cases deciding against the Muslim claim, the Muslim claimant. And more recently then, there have been surveys that look at religious liberty claims, and this encompasses everything from the First Amendment and 14th Amendment to statutory claims, including Title VII, RFRA, ARLUPA, and others. So in these cases, what we find is that our courts apply U.S. law, looking to the First Amendment, free exercise, free speech, non-establishment, and the statutory requirements to balance the rights of individual plaintiffs against the confines of the constitutional and statutory requirements. So sometimes those cases come out for Muslim plaintiffs and sometimes against, but it's always with respect to U.S. law, or I should say typically with respect to U.S. law rather than Islamic law. So So this is where the against defining Islamic law and picking winners in this arena comes up. And the major areas, just to give you an idea, where Islamic law comes up are in equal protection claims, contract law, and First Amendment or free exercise claims. 74%, as an aside, come from prisons, others from the employment context. And the other area where it comes up is foreign law, where courts have to decide whether they will give comity to foreign legal judgments. And just to be clear, courts make a distinction between civil law and religious law. So there's never a court that says, oh, well, because Islamic law says this, we will apply this law here. But it has to be that Pakistan has adopted in its civil code some text that may be based on Islamic law, but the point for the courts is to look at the civil code. So how do religious liberty claims of Muslim Americans compare? The paper has made its way to me. So in the courts proper, a recent study by two professors, Gregory Sisk and Michael Heiss, sort of took a long view survey of some 2,000 cases to see how Muslim Americans' claims compare to those of other religious minorities. And there, the conclusion is that there's a distinct Muslim disadvantage in the courts. Even before 9/11, but perhaps exacerbated after 9/11. So Muslims that assert free exercise or accommodation claims end up having a likelihood for success of 22%, as opposed to the 38% for non-Muslim claimants in religious free exercise or accommodation claims. So in other words, Muslim claimants had only about half the chance to achieve accommodation that was enjoyed by claimants from other religious communities, and we can talk about some theories as to why. But one result or one related phenomenon is that there's this push in state legislatures to ban Sharia, Islamic law, and the citation of foreign law or Sharia, and really pointing to a false problem, whereas there is no evidence of the court system wholesale going wrong and citing Sharia law or Islamic law. So the real problem there is there are laws that are tackling a problem that doesn't exist and doing so in an overbroad way that isn't actually attacking any problem of relevance. So what about the future then? And I'll wrap up by just pointing to two ideas. One is that Islamic law seems to be a space now for a battleground over the meaning of religious liberty and equal protection here in America. And as a policy matter, this actually has significant consequences, because the way that we construct religious liberty in America not only goes to our own domestic ideals and constitutional ideals of what that means, but then it can also have global implications, which will affect the extent to which we model for other countries worldwide, and not just Muslim countries, but we can focus on Muslim countries in the aftermath of the Arab Spring. And just to end with a quote from the folks that put together the study, Sisk and Heiss, they said that like Catholic and Jewish immigrants before, Muslims in America, both immigrants and the increasing numbers of native-born Muslims, strive to maintain their identity and hold fast to their core beliefs while becoming a part of the mainstream of American life. Whether the robust promise of the American experiment in religious liberty still holds will be tested in the coming years by the experiences of Muslims as citizens, co-workers, and neighbors, and if that promise is kept, the message of freedom may well resonate beyond our borders. Thank you.
Thank you, Intisar. Well, I think that we should devote the 5 minutes. We started a bit late, so I suggest that we try to end at around 10 past 11. Is it too late? 5 past? 5 past, all right. So you didn't silence me. But what I was very impressed with is how you could put in 10 minutes so much scholarship. That was I think that the points that you're raising actually are counterintuitive to the extent that, going back to Ben's immediate remark, Ben's reaction to the frivolous dimension of the debate on Islamic law in this country, my sense is that it may not be as frivolous as liberals, quote unquote, we have a reaction to. I think there will be inevitably, in courts and elsewhere, more substantive debates on a number of claims, and I think that's what I get from Intisar, and that not only will the debate not leave us for political reasons, but the debate will not leave us in the short term for fundamental legal reasons. But I don't know if you want to comment on this, Intisar.
Yeah, I just want to say I agree with that sentiment largely, and just to qualify my framing of these things as frivolous, I think as it stands on the merits of the legal questions, they aren't particularly interesting or fraught or open questions as to the meaning of the First Amendment in these contexts, or the Supremacy Clause for that matter in this context, what laws judges should apply. But I do think substantive questions do come up and can come up in the future as to the meaning if the application of these laws ends up being in a disparate way, as is the case so far, according to these and other surveys.
Thank you very much for a wonderful session.